Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by Keith Preston, Swithun, Dobson, and Terminal Philosophy to discuss the term socialism as it's used in the contemporary discourse by socialists. So, one of the problems is, what does socialism even mean anymore? If you talk to, the average socialist, bread tuber, they'll be like, well, it's good things good people do, or people not profits. Utterly vacuous, self-serving definitions. For people who aren't socialist, it's bad things bad people do. Not a whole lot more helpful. Socialism initially meant the abolition of all class, sex, religion, state, and family distinctions. But what does that even look like? Slavoj Žižek over the last couple of years has been pointing out that we have no idea what day one of the revolution looks like. All the movies, all the sort of fictional accounts of a socialist revolution end with the revolution. We have no idea of what it actually looks like as an end state. And then this is a problem that sort of bedeviled socialism from the beginning. Nechayev, the radical nihilist revolutionary in Russia, said, "The revolution despises all doctrines and refuses to accept the mundane sciences, leaving them for future generations. And with this end in view, the society thus refuses to impose any new organization from above. Any future organization will doubtless work its way through the movement and life of the people, but this is a matter for future generations to decide. Our task is terrible, total, universal, and merciless destruction." And so, right out of the gate, they're like, well, look, we're not here to talk about what the end state looks like. And one of the things I've also noticed is how socialism is used. It already has this sort of archaic, arcane terminology that goes back, to the 19th century. And then even people who are conversant with it have their own unique takes on all of these terms. So these terms are functionally, useless because each individual socialist has their own special spin on it. And I'm like, well, okay, I don't know what your spin is. And there's no canonical definition. Like there's no, socialist encyclopedia, which is equivalent to the Jewish or Catholic encyclopedia, where I can look up what all these words mean and what all these concepts mean. If we look at socialism as a historical movement, there's broadly speaking two strands, a more libertarian and a more statist strand. The libertarian strand is composed of utopian socialists and anarchists, and the more statist strand is composed of reformists and vanguardists. But almost all of these strands are much more, they don't really exist as discrete ideas like they used to. They're kind of all blended together superficially. And this is as much the fault of socialists themselves as anyone else. And now we got people like AOC and Bernie Sanders saying that we're socialist. Socialism works. Look at Denmark. But then you've got the president of Denmark in one of the economic forums saying that Denmark isn't socialist. It's a market economy with a generous welfare state. And I could easily envision, Leninists and anarchists of 100 years ago criticizing Denmark as reformism and reformist. When I use the word socialist, it seems to me that the best way to use it is in its historical sense. And when you look at a term, you can either look at it in a sort of theoretical sense, what theoretical construct is it describing, or what historical reality is it describing. So when the American founding fathers were describing what an American republic would look like before independence, that's meaningful because they can give you a concrete, defined theoretical model. And then they implemented it, 20 years after they conceived of it in 1783. And so the question then is, well, what's the theoretical? Well, there is no actual future theoretical model for socialism because socialists have assiduously avoided talking about this day after the revolution. And so then that leaves us with only historical examples. And the only historical example that really worked at all, in scare quotes, was the Soviet Union, state ownership of the means of production. And that's what socialism used to mean for many years. And now you'll hear, well, socialism is democratic control of the workplace, or certain left libertarians will say that socialism is an absolutely free market, and they'll point to some individuals, anarchists in the United States. Some of these are actually mutually incompatible definitions of socialism, and then others would be abolition of private property. And the other problem is with socialism as it's currently existing is they'll say an economy that isn't motivated by profit. And I'm like, what does that even look like or even mean? Because going from the slavocracies of the ancient Near East to the proto-bourgeoisie of Phoenicia and Greece to feudalism to slavery again in the 18th century, they're all profit driven. You might find historical examples of internal markets that aren't profit driven, like the Hutterites, the Catholic monastic system, the Jesuits in South America, but they don't even go that far. And even those historical examples had to engage in market exchange with people outside the system. And so the state, in my mind, of socialism as a term that's used is it's extremely vacuous and at this point functionally useless. I don't know what it would take to make it a meaningful descriptor of anything at this point. I think you have something to say on that, Keith.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with virtually everything you said, except I'd argue that socialism has kind of become full circle because back in the day when socialism first started to become a thing, which was about 200 years ago in Europe, socialism was a lot like today in the sense that it basically just meant anything. It meant it was just sort of a term for all purposes, do-gooder reformism. And in fact, if you read the Communist Manifesto, in that pamphlet, Marx and Engels are actually lambasting that. They're saying, well, you have all these different kinds of people who claim to be socialist, and and a lot of them are just crackpots, and a lot of them are these utopian dreamers, and some of them are people from the elite that are just trying to be do-gooders, or I mean, they really go down the list of why they reject all these other kinds of socialism. Feudal socialism is one thing they mention, or which is basically meant reformism from the top or from the aristocracy, or utopian socialism. They were attacking people like Charles Fourier. Then, of course, they were saying, but we've got the correct kind, which is actually scientific socialism, because we have a scientific theory that validates our perspective. So they claimed, and they always distinguished. Marx and Engels always distinguished their communism from socialism as it was understood in the broader sense, which they would dismiss as a middle class reformist kind of do-gooder movement, or as something that was popular among utopians, like these people that would set up these utopian colonies like New Harmony and that kind of thing. So this whole way of thinking of socialism as just sort of an all-purposes do-gooderism actually has its roots in very early modern socialism in the early 19th century. But over time, what happens is that socialism starts to change, where you start to get these ideological movements that do have somewhat more a more specific ideological framework they're using to describe their views. And I think it's true that 19th century socialism, and it's in the late 19th century, had more closely resembled something like what would be called libertarian socialism or anarchism or something like that today. If you look at what all the leading socialist intellectuals of that time period said, it was very similar to kind of like what later comes to be called council communism or guild socialism or syndicalism or anarcho-communism and all those kinds of things. At that point, socialism wasn't really identified with statism per se. Now, you always had state socialists. You always did have socialists who believed in setting up an authoritarian state that manages the economy. You had ideas like that came out of the French Revolution. Some of the early socialist theorists that influenced Marx, like Babeuf and Leblanc, and some of those had ideas like that. So that strand within socialism was always there. And then in the 20th century, the Bolsheviks take that idea and run with it. They take this idea of this kind of top-down managerial socialism, and they create a socialist state that's modeled on this kind of idea, Bolshevism, which to a lot of other socialists at the time, that the Bolsheviks were considered to be somewhat of a deviation. I mean, like think today, for example, you have all these people who think of themselves as socialists, like the Democratic Socialists of America and the Green Party and I mean, there are tons of these, and the Bernie fans and all that kind of stuff. There are tons of these people, and they would look at a group like, say, the RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Maoists, the Avakianites, and think, wow, that's just a lunatic group. But what if that was the group that ended up seizing control of the state? Well, that's actually what happened in the Russian Revolution. You had this far fringe, group that all the other socialists thought were crazy that actually seized power. That's actually what happened. So at that point, socialism comes to be identified with this kind of totalitarian command economy. Now, one thing that I think is interesting is that Michael Parenti, who was a leading Marxist intellectual, he's probably in his 80s now, but he's been around forever and he's always been some sort of an intellectual hero to the far left, but who is a Marxist Leninist. He will actually say, yeah, something like Leninism is actually the natural application of socialism. He says it's not a. He said it's not a coincidence that all of the actual socialist revolutions, whether it was in Russia or China, or North Korea, or Vietnam, or Cuba, or Zimbabwe, or wherever, they all created this kind of Marxist-Leninist state or something similar to it. And he said, and his argument is basically, yeah, if you want to have socialism and your goal is to redistribute resources according to, at least theoretically, according to need or an egalitarian way or something like that, that's the kind of system you have to have. So what those kinds of systems end up creating is something kind of like what you have in the military. I mean, the military is kind of like socialism in the sense that it's not egalitarian, obviously. It's a very strict hierarchical ranking system, but it is a system based on from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. That's kind of how the military works. Um, and that's kind of how the actually existing socialist states, the 20th century functioned. They were more or less military bureaucracies. They were, I guess you could say, they were military bureaucratic states that did ration resources. It's very similar to the way a military actually does things. But now that that kind of socialism has actually disappeared, and to a large degree, it's fallen into ill repute because we don't have the Soviet Union anymore, and then China has moved more in a market direction. They have this kind of mercantilist economy now, and you have very few actual communist states, maybe North Korea and a couple others, but. Now socialism has actually gone back to being what it was in the early 19th century. It's just this kind of euphemism for just do-gooderism of any kind. If you're against animal cruelty, you're a socialist or something like that. And you have all these people with all of this this hodgepodge of social reform ideas calling themselves socialists. Now, one thing I would point out is when the socialists in the United States, the self-proclaimed socialists, say that they want the Scandinavian model, that's their model. What you said, Todd, is absolutely correct. Those are not socialist countries in any identifiable sense. I mean, those are capitalist countries. I mean, I've lived in one of them. They have, they have corporations. They have big corporations. They have, private ownership of the means of production. They have stock market. They have shareholders and all that kind of stuff. They do have a larger welfare state than the United States has. Although the United States has a much larger, military system and all of that, so the United States is not less statist than those countries are. It's arguably more statist, but those countries certainly have a large welfare system, social welfare system. But what Americans who call themselves socialists really are, they're not so much socialists as much as they're progressives. They're within this American progressive tradition that's about using the public administration state for social reform purposes. Like in the early, they're very similar to what the progressives of 100 years ago were. If you look up the progressives, they have the same ideas as modern progressives, except they've done an about face on a few things like race. The old progressives were into eugenics and stuff like that. And they were also more conservative about sexuality and some of that kind of stuff as well, at least on some issues. So modern American so-called socialists are really just progressives. They're really within this progressive, American tradition, which was an idea that was actually imported from Germany, but not from the left. It was imported from the Prussian bureaucracy that was established back in the 18th and 19th century under thinkers like leaders like Frederick the Great, then later Otto von Bismarck. I mean, that's really what progressivism is. It doesn't have anything to do with Marxism. And again, their socialism, this Scandinavian system, is just welfare capitalism.
Yeah, terminal philosophy. What are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. I think it is unquestionable that this classic dichotomy of socialist versus capitalist, like the downtrodden 19th century worker of Western Europe, up against the mustache twirling Daddy Warbucks monocle guy. That's definitely a totally outdated dichotomy at this point. And just as you and Keith have and Swithun have all talked about in previous streams, um, it's interesting to find out that Marx didn't write very much about what a proletariat state would look like. Again, and I think this is actually really interesting because it's led to this tremendous source of anxiety and confusion amongst a lot of his followers today. And as a result of that confusion and anxiety, you have this whole pantheon of different socialist types. For example, nowadays, yeah, if you're spend any time on BreadTube, and it's been this way historically, that it's been fairly typical that the anarchists hate the Bolsheviks or the Marxist Leninist types, or it's very common that what is it, the Leninists can't stand the Trotskyites. I mean, you name it, and vice versa. And it's perhaps this inner conflict within the Marxist socialist sphere that prevents them from making serious political gains here and there. What Keith was talking about earlier about Scandinavia and whether or not it's capitalist or socialist or not, I would mostly agree that it's capitalist because free markets do exist within all those countries, and Finland has Nokia, and you name it. However, what I think is really going on in terms of capitalism versus socialism is that most economies these days in the West would appear to have this sort of hybridization between capitalism and socialism, and as a result, you have this complex and oftentimes over-engineered and complex bureaucracy as a result of that. So that's something I think a little more interesting in the development of the dichotomy of socialism versus capitalism. And then, it would appear to just throughout history, it's not that I'm attempting to do the leftist tactic and deconstruct Marxism, but just using history as your guide, it would be apparent that there are many socialist movements in history where those movements deviated from Marx. I mean, for example, I think Mao placed the peasant class as opposed to the industrial class because China didn't have much of an industry at the time as the centerpiece of the proletariat revolution in China. Or a more nationalist interpretation of socialism could be considered Mussolini's fascist Italy, where you have the concept of the proletariat nation, Italy being among the proletariat nations, and the oppressive capitalist countries being the United States, Great Britain, and France, and maybe a few other places. So yeah, it's a bit of a mess of things now. That's kind of interesting what you said, Keith, that now it's kind of come back to its sort of original historical definition. Although I'd probably argue that all of us, whether you're a socialist or not, we're all swimming in this this like ocean of different concepts, and it's really hard for any one movement to really attain the term socialism. Those are just my initial thoughts.
Yeah, Swithun, what are some of your thoughts?
What I think is, anytime I've ever seen the word socialism used historically or contemporaneously, it really, I think one of the commonalities of the way it's used is to refer to some form of egalitarianism of some description. I think that would say be the common thread, either sort of socially or economically. And I think when you come to the older sort of state socialists and the anarchists, to a large extent, I think it's a difference over means to achieve the egalitarian future rather than what that would look like, obviously bracketing what it would actually look like is not very clear, as you've pointed out many times before. But in general, I think the primary difference there is over means of achieving it. You also, though, some of the socialists wouldn't necessarily be socially egalitarian. sorry, that's probably a fair way of describing it. I'm thinking primarily of now whether you want to call them outright socialists or not. Members of, say, the labour movement in the early 20th century in England, especially with the Labour Party, which considered itself a socialist party, had clause for nationalisation. A lot of them were Methodists and very socially conservative, but they were economically egalitarian in that sense. So I think really you can make a distinction between essentially 4 types of socialism among 2 axes. One is, well, no, not 4. Yeah. Are you economically egalitarian? Are you socially egalitarian? And then how are you going to achieve it? Do you go for the anarchist position, or do you go for the strong status position to achieve it? And that's broadly the 4 types you could get. And so even though the democratic socialists today, like Bernie Sanders, who is, as Keith said, basically progressive, if you put that in the tent of socialism, is like a halfway house. It's a little bit of egalitarianism economically, but it's a bit of progressive sort of social egalitarianism at the same time. So obviously they're sort of ideal types. They're not necessarily 4 quadrants in which you have to swim. But that's what I would say primarily is the way I think would be the commonalities in which the word socialism has been used historically and today. And just in general, though, as you've pointed out, for those who self-describe as socialist, socialist functions in the same way as a supporter of democracy. We would use the word democracy. Oh, it's democratic. It just means it's good. In the same way, oh, it's socialist. Oh, it's good. And similarly, in reverse, if you're not a self-described socialist, all socialism means is bad. So if it's a Fox News or other sort of self-described conservative sites, socialism is just, well, it just means bad. I mean, like the current system, I mean, they all harken back to Reaganism in the 80s. And like, Reagan isn't really that much different to what exists at present. It's just welfare state capitalism. And okay, it might have moved a little bit, to a bit more welfare statism, but it's kind of the same thing, except they'll go crazy and think that you've got Bolshevism. So to a large extent now, it's just it's pejorative and used by those who dislike the self-described socialists, and the socialists themselves, it just means good. And that's effectively how it's been rendered today.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that muddies the conversation is how socialism intersects with fascism. So, for example, you'll hear socialists say, well, it's worker control of factories. And I'm like, well, Mussolini in What is Fascism advocated worker control. He writes, we must go towards the people. We wish the working classes to accustom themselves to the responsibilities of management so that they may realize that it is no easy matter to run a business. And then he says, it may be objected that this program implies a return to guilds. No matter. I therefore hope this assembly will accept the economic claims advanced by national syndicalism. Now, what's interesting, well, then what's syndicalism? Well, that was a sort of organizational economic platform by Georges Sorel, who actually praised Mussolini as a second Lenin. And many syndicalists became fascists. And a lot of ANCOMs and Chomskyites want to claim Sorel and syndicalism. Well, if syndicalism can give rise to Mussolini and fascism and the CNT-FI, is fascism sort of an illegitimate child of socialism, or isn't it? And is worker control really enough? Because I actually asked the socialists once, like, well, he didn't really believe in worker control. Yeah, well, neither did the Soviet Union. I mean, they didn't really believe in it either. Talk to the sailors at Kronstadt, right? So, I mean, or is the Soviet Union red fascism? I mean, this kind of nonsense we see with recently, Vaush and Caleb Malpin had an argument over was China genociding the Uyghurs. And it pretty much boiled down to Spider-Man v. Spider-Man. No, you're the real fascist. And it was kind of hilarious. And then we've also got people on the alt-right like Keith Woods who are and Nasbol, and they're like, well, no, socialism is actually really a right-wing idea, and like this left-wing anarchist. So at this point, I mean, that's a whole nother set of wrinkles. Is fascism socialist? Is it not? On some superficial level, it seems to be. They certainly seem to have a common intellectual genealogy. And is that enough? I mean, it just makes it even more crazy. What are some of your thoughts on that, Keith?
Well, there's a lot that can be said about that as well. Um, One of the things we're talking about now veer over into a number of other topics, like the entire, you know, economic, the evolution of economics in the 20th century, as well as the wider philosophical and intellectual differences between the left and the right, because how you see socialism largely is going to be influenced by how you see these other questions. But um, if we look at the actual evolution of economic systems in the 20th century, once this older 19th century model of bourgeois capitalism started to fade, you do start to see these new systems replacing it. And I think the individual that had the greatest insights into what actually happened was James Burnham. He was a former Trotskyite who, in the 1940s, wrote about what he called the managerial revolution. And what he pointed out was that technological expansion, and the growth of mass society, population growth, and that kind of stuff had created a system that had largely rendered the kind of 19th century capitalism obsolete. And you had these new kinds of systems that were developing that he called the managerial revolution. And he said that this was something that cut across different systems of government, different ideologies, and all of that. He argued that he was writing in the 1940s, and he argued this was happening in the Western liberal democracies like America and England. It was happening in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and it was happening in the Soviet Union. Even though these countries all had different ideologies and different governmental systems, he argued that what was developing was this technocratic managerial class, that this technocratic managerial class was largely supplanting the older, industrial bourgeoisie of the 19th century, which tended to be more of these family dynasties and that kind of stuff, the Rockefellers and that kind of thing. I mean, not that they went away entirely, but they were having to more and more share their position with the rise of this new managerial class. And I think that that's really the characteristic that both Western social democracy or liberalism or welfare capitalism or whatever shares with fascism and National Socialism and with Bolshevism, and that they all are somewhat reflective of this the rise of this modern technocratic class that happened in all of these systems. It's also interesting to recognize that which of these models became dominant was largely dependent on the level of economic development you saw in different countries. Bolshevism, for whatever reason, seems to have become popular and been successful in countries, or at least temporarily successful, in countries that had largely not achieved industrialization. If you look at every country that ever experienced a communist revolution, most of them were essentially agricultural or feudal societies that were maybe just beginning to show some basic sign of industrial development, from Russia onward, Russia, China, all of these. Whereas fascism, if you look at the countries where fascism or fascist-like movements became dominant, what you see is that those tended to be societies that already had some stage of industrialization, but usually it was an earlier stage of industrialization. And usually it was a country that was either directly or indirectly under the domination of some external power. That's how Mussolini conceived of fascism. He conceived of Italy as a proletarian nation, and his idea was, well, the class struggle is not really between the workers and the bosses. We've got to get the workers and the bosses on the same page, and that's what National Syndicalism was. It was sort of like creating this kind of corporate state where we're not going to have Marxist class struggle, but we're not going to have do your own thing capitalism either. The workers and the bosses both have to be subordinated to the state, which is the manifestation of the nation. And the real struggle is between a proletarian nation that's under the domination of the Atlanticist powers like England and America. And that's kind of how German National Socialism structured its at least its theoretical foundations as well. Um, and you see that in fascist and quasi-fascist and para-fascist movements, everywhere during the 20th century. Some of the movements that are comparable in the Middle East were like that. If you look at uh, say Baathism in Iraq and Syria and places like that, as well as Pan-Arabism and Nasserism and even Gaddafi and some of that stuff. You see all of those or even the Ayatollah Khomeini. In all of those systems, you see a society that has achieved some degree of industrialization. These are not just purely peasant societies. Right? But you also see that they're in an earlier stage of industrialization than what you see in the more advanced countries. And they're usually at the time they experience the rise of these movements, they're under the domination of some external power. Usually it was Western colonial powers that are, that they view as monopolizing their oil trade or whatever. It was a Middle Eastern country or whatever. And then the revolution, the Ba'athist revolution, or the Khomeini revolution, or the Gaddafi revolution, or whatever, the Nasser revolution is conceived of as either some kind of nationalist or pan-Arabic or Islamist or something or other kind of revolution against this, hegemonic external power, the great Satan, the Americans or the British or whomever. And that seems to be what fascism is. It seems to be the kind of context in which movements like that, fascisms or fascism-like movements, seem to evolve. Whereas this idea of welfare capitalism seems to take root mostly in advanced industrial societies that are already wealthy and already are in a very advanced stage of industrialization, like America and England and the oceanic countries and Western and Northern Europe. That's where social democracy or what Americans call liberalism or welfare capitalism or progressivism. That's what those kinds of movements tend to take root. So I think that the influence of these ideas largely is dependent on the geopolitical position as well as the level of economic development you find in a particular country, and then as far as the wider idea of where do they fit on the left-right spectrum, and what about the role of nationalism, and is fascism a sort of a high sort of say a heresy of the left or something like that. You can I think it's possible to frame it in that way, but it also is somewhat relative, to which I tend to think that the left-right model of the spectrum doesn't always fit everything anyway. I mean, there are certain things that you can think of as right or left, like if you are familiar with, say, Thomas Sowell's idea of constrained versus unconstrained visions, or say Paul Gottfried's idea, well, the right is about tradition and hierarchy and the particular, whereas the left is about egalitarianism and universalism and all that. I think on a more philosophical level, that separates the left and the right. But when it comes to purely economic questions, I'm not sure that those models work, because you have German National Socialism, Nazism. I mean, is that left or right? Well, it's obviously far right in the sense that it's imperialist and racial supremacist and all that, but it's not the traditional right. I mean, they hated the monarch, the aristocracy, and the traditional monarchy and the clerics. I mean, they like Heinrich Himmler once said that after the war they were going to liquidate the Catholic clergy alongside with the Jews. So that's obviously not the traditional right, but it doesn't have the egalitarian and universalist idea that you see on the hard left either. So who knows?
Yeah, what are some of your thoughts, terminal philosophy?
Yeah, I think I agree with all that. The two books where I really have come to understand fascism is from Stanley Payne, The History of Fascism, as well as Paul Gottfried's Fascism, A Career of a Concept. And, especially with Paul Gottfried, when you read that book, one of the central ideas is that fascism is something more of a political phenomenon that existed in the past and did exist for a time, but that no longer exists today. But since 1945 and up until this very moment, the abuse of the term fascism is so ubiquitous that it's just vacuous and stupid and dishonest. I mean, Donald Trump is apparently a fascist. I mean, there's about a million things wrong with Donald Trump, and or the neocons are fascists. And I am not a fan of the neocons whatsoever, and their misadventures in the Middle East. But can you call them fascists? Probably not. And again, it's a favorite insult. It's the most popular political swear word that I can possibly imagine. Yeah, as you mentioned, Todd, there is sort of this revival of conversation and fascism for both the dissident and alt-right, as well as kind of the bread tube, tanky tube kind of scenes. Whereas for the hard leftists and the tankies, there's sort of this this predictable doubling down of yes, fascism is alive and well somehow, and it's in the form of woke capitalism apparently, but really, but they're still fascists somehow. And then Keith Woods and some of the Radix folks are doing something a little more interesting, where, as you said, they're now advocating for third positionism, which is arguably probably a more modern form of fascism and nationalism, but probably it would lack the military expansionism and some of the more draconian things that came along with some fascist regimes of the 20th century. So that's kind of interesting what's happening there. But really, I think if you're being historically honest, I mean, fascism was destroyed and blown to pieces by the Allies, and then the new, and then the Cold War happened. And that was, of course, between capitalist and communist powers. So. Yeah, and one other point I wanted to make too is that with this evolving definition of socialism, just take a moment to reflect on who the modern day proletariat might be here in the United States. Well, some of them, or a lot of them, are probably Donald Trump supporters, or steel workers, steel fabricators, plumbers, electricians, farmers, pipe fitters, you name it. That is probably, whenever you think mentally of what a modern working class folk might look like, it's mostly that. And and then for the Great Britain, it'd probably Brexit supporters, or the same, just working class farming folk, blue collar types. And socialists have a unique problem in the sense that they have to convince these working masses that somehow, I mean, you guys probably know where I'm going with this, but we have to overthrow the bourgeois powers that be, but we'll still, I don't know, we'll figure out these cultural issues and false consciousness things later. But they have a very difficult PR situation on their hands, as appealing to average everyday workers and truck drivers. And I don't know how they'll go about that. It doesn't mean that it can't happen. One interesting thing is that, if this sort of form of like woke welfare capitalism goes so far as to abandon a lot of these working masses in the United States, that's where potentially the Democratic Party can take votes, working class votes, away from the Republicans or something like that. That's yeah, I'll probably keep it to that for now.
All right, Swithun, thoughts on that?
Just on fascism, it seems to me that fascism primarily was a form of third positionism, which was primarily just a response to socialism. It was, well, we're not capitalists. That was kind of bad, but the socialists, they're a little bit too radical. We better not do that. That will just be social upheaval, etc., etc. And of course, socialism is associated with atheism. And so you have the support of sort of the Catholic Church with fascist regimes, etc. And so they're more obviously sort of socially conservative, and it's more conservative in the sense that the property titles they're not completely upended in the sense that they were, say, in Soviet Russia. So that, I would say, is kind of where fascism comes from, and there's a very specific historical democracy and sort of worker control to some extent, obviously with bosses as well, because it was supposed to be a third. It was a hybrid. It was between the extremes of socialism and of capitalism, which makes sense. But as you pointed out, yeah, fascism is just bad. I don't think anyone in most cases, because it simply has a word that has effectively no content. I think it's interesting what terminal philosophy was saying about who the current proletariat would be in the context of sort of classic socialist thought. And yeah, I would agree with him. They have the standard sort of skilled blue collar people, etc., who would be the proletarians of today. And it's interesting with that you could say, at least in England, in the UK, the way to pacify them has been to be reformist and just give them more free stuff, because that's basically what the Tory party did, who in trying to keep the Brexit supporting Labour Party voters, kind of went, well, austerity is bad, let's give you free stuff and have lots of public works programs and spending, etc., because they wish to maintain they wanted to get the working class Labour vote, who had always been Labour, to vote for them, which worked because they had the biggest majority they had since 1987. And interesting as well with that is the working class vote tends to be more socially conservative than the upper middle class types who the Labour Party, similar to Democrats, now get most of their support base from, which is at least interesting. So yes, on sort of socialism, you could say that they've in England, you've attempted to pacify more socialist sentiment by giving more free stuff out, because you did have possibly a genuine socialist candidate in a sense in the last election, the Jeremy Corbyn, who was advocating for nationalisation. Now, granted, it was only the utilities and the railways. He wasn't sort of getting rid of all the corporations in steel or whatever. So quite mild sort of socialism by historic standards. But still, you had that. And I think economically speaking, the conversation politically is further, quote unquote, left than it was, say, 20 years ago or so. So those would be some of my thoughts on that.
All right. So Keith, what would your summary be on this whole discussion today?
Well, we've really barely scratched the surface in terms of things we could talk about. I think terminal philosophy raised some important points before, and that is there's this question of who would be the proletariat today. And in the United States, it's quite obvious. It would be what we call the working to middle class. The working to middle class, what Americans think of as the middle class is really a working class that, due to a variety of historical and technological and economic circumstances, for a long time had what was essentially an upper middle class standard of living. But even though it's still a working class, essentially a proletariat, these high wage, high skilled workers. And I mentioned James Burnham earlier. There's another work that I would highly recommend. It's called Leviathan and Its Enemies by Sam Francis, who was a paleoconservative and argued, he took Burnham's work and updated it a bit, but he was talking about how in the United States you have this, and I would argue in most of the developed world, at least the Western developed world, you have this, what he called the post-bourgeois proletariat, and that is you have this kind of what we think of as the working to middle class that's really a historic proletariat, but is under the rule of this kind of new managerial capitalism, although it's not that new anymore, but it emerged out of the Depression, World War II era. And that's really how class relations are defined in developed countries today. You have this managerial capitalism, which in today's world is moving more and more towards this woke ideology. But then you have this post bourgeois proletariat that is the actual proletariat that Marx was writing about. I mean, if you look at Marx's writings and how he characterized different classes, which class most closely resembles the historic proletariat? It's this working to middle class that many of whom, as terminal philosophy said, are Donald Trump supporters. And then that gets into this cultural question of, well, isn't it interesting that the working class is more socially conservative than the power elite? That was always true, though. If you go back and you look at 19th century socialism, Thomas Sowell has an interesting biographical sketch of Marx where he talks about who Marx the man actually was, and Marx was very much like today's bohemian radicals. He was someone of bourgeois background who lived a bohemian life much of his life. Basically just a petty loser. I mean, he sounds like he could be an Antifa or something like that if you actually go back and you look at Marx's life history. But ironically, though, a lot of the people that are considered the far left today are not proletarians. For example, this urban underclass that we have that's largely minority, that would be considered a lumpen proletariat by Marxist standards. And also these college students that are into protest demonstrations and wokeness and all that kind of stuff. That's more of a bohemian type of culture that, I mean, the historic communists put people like that in concentration camps. So it's interesting to see how all this how this is unfolding. But yeah, I mean, in today's world, it's this declining working to middle class that many of whom are Trump voters, not all by any means, who would be the proletariat, and then this kind of woke capitalism is sort of like what the bourgeoisie was in the 19th century, in that you had this rising class of elites that were rooted in this new economy and all this new technology that actually were often much more liberal than their aristocratic and royalist predecessors, and were certainly more socially liberal than a lot of the working classes, and certainly the peasants were. And then that leads into the problems that the Marxists started writing about in the post-World War I era, which is, why is it that the workers rallied behind patriotism during World War I? They should have been fighting the class struggle. So that's how you get ideas like Antonio Gramsci's idea of hegemonics, or like, the Frankfurt School, where they sort of inverse the relationship between culture and class. They invented what some people call cultural Marxism, which really isn't Marxism. I guess you could say it's neo-Marxism, but if you abandon historical materialism, then you're not Marxist. You might be something else, a revisionist Marxist or something. So, and that's kind of what the left is today, the political left, and people today who claim to be socialists, most of whom are just like the early 19th century socialists. They're mostly middle class, reformer, do-gooder, whatever. A lot of them are, bohemian class people. And to even the ones that are more serious, that take Marx more seriously, they're really more like cultural Marxists or Gramscians than actual Marxists.
Yeah. So what would your summary be, terminal philosophy?
Yeah, well, just to reiterate, it's really difficult these days to have a firm working definition of socialism. That's not to say that everything that's come out of socialism or the French Revolution necessarily was a bad idea. I mean, I think, again, Keith, when he said he's lived in a Scandinavian country for a while, you can argue that, again, like Ben Shapiro would argue, like, this is a hardcore capitalist country, and then others would disagree with him and say, well, no, there's this, but they have all these these social safety nets, and I think both of those assertions are definitely true. And kind of what you have nowadays, especially with Germany, with like strong working unions, but with a high concentration of corporations and free markets, what you could say is going on is just this interesting synthesis between socialism and capitalism, with capitalism being the operational backdrop, where there might be socialist ideas here or there, like certain social safety nets that I think some of us could at least agree are probably beneficial for society. I mean, there's a whole series of debates around that, whether it's too expensive or if it's infringing on the financial freedoms of the taxpayer and so on. But I just wanted to say real quick too, as far as anti-capitalist rhetoric goes, I do have to shill a little bit for an internet friend by a guy by the name of Pill Eater, or Francis Nally. He has this interesting approach to anti-capitalism that's not so much left-wing or right-wing, but he has this interesting artistic approach to anti-capitalism, how capitalism ends up co-opting a lot of any particular political movements. And as a result, well, because we have so much freedom here in the West, you could argue that too much freedom makes a lot of people miserable to a certain existential extent. So as a way of doing something about that, you form yourself into an artist. And so I'll just leave that for the viewers to look into Pill Eater or Francis Nally's anti-capitalist theory, if you want to call it that. But that's one of the more interesting things going on in terms of that. I think that's actually a great, viable anti-capitalist critique. And as for just this conversation in general, yeah, I think that socialism simply just there will always be this battle over what it means to be a true socialist, and you're going to always have these debates between Vaush and Caleb Maupin, or Danke Kang is another popular YouTube Marxist-Leninist type who, it's just going to be an ongoing struggle. And I suppose I'll just leave it at that.
All right, you get the last word, Swithun.
To repeat from the beginning, I think even though people use socialism in different ways, etc., I think ultimately it's either economic or social egalitarianism, and the question is, how do you get there? Is it dictatorship of the proletariat or something similar, or would you go towards the more anarchist end? And I think that really covers what would generally be considered sort of socialism as such. But what I would say is, in a sense, what socialism means is essentially irrelevant to a large extent. Different people use socialism in different ways. The question is just to get people to explain what their ideas actually are, so you can actually understand the positions they actually hold. There's far too many debates that revolve around fetishizing a word. And even if the other party is using socialism, for example, in a very idiosyncratic manner, it's irrelevant. Ignore it. Just use their definition for the purpose of the debate, of the discussion, and go from there. Because people can just hide behind words all the time. For example, I saw this screenshot from Twitter from somebody who said that someone previously said they were raped by some trans woman or man, I can't remember which. And then someone said, no, that's not rape, because rape is about power and trans people have the least power of anybody else, so you couldn't possibly have been raped by one. And they're like, oh, okay, if you want to use rape in that way, fine, but was it forcible? Was it forcible penetration? Yes. Okay, is that bad? Like, it doesn't matter if you're going to call it rape or if you're in a really idiosyncratic manner. I don't care. So this is just a plea for everybody, just to ignore fetishizing words and just talk about ideas.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for your contributions. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast.